Thank you for coming. My name's Robert Reinhardt. I'm here to talk about off-the-shelf video players. Ironically, I get a longer session for a longer session time slot than what I feel I would need for this, but hopefully we can have some dialogue if you want to have dialogue around players. I think my demos will be pretty short and sweet. I'm not here to really say one vendor is better than another. It's really, I think, if there's one thing I can do during this session, it's walk you through the process that I would take with any client of mine that is asking about how to vet different player technologies and what they should be doing with their content. I'll just skip past the summary here. Here's my contact information. I know we're going straight into the lunch right after this, so I imagine we're all gonna try and go get our food, but feel free to grab me at any point during the conference. I'm co-chair with Jan Ozer for the new Video Engineering Summit, so I'll be over in that wing of the building for most of the conference if you want to find me to talk over any of this or any of the other sessions that I've presented or will be presenting. So this session largely came out of an update to an article I wrote on Streaming Media Magazine. In fact, if I search Google right now for Robert Reinhardt choosing player streaming media, I'll probably find, it's funny, Jan Ozer, who was just here, said he called this, it was a seminal article at the time, and I took that as a compliment. You can see me in my doctor's outfit there, but all my articles here, geez, it's such an old one, I don't know if I'm gonna have to go down to it, but I just wanted to highlight this because it's largely the same article but updated that I wrote over 4 years ago, and I thought it was going to come up first, and there it is. So back in January of 2014, gosh, time flies, I wrote this article. It was in the print issue as well, choosing a video player features and specs for the top 5 that I looked at the time. I basically re-examined that list. I took JPlayer off of it, which is still around JPlayer, not JWPlayer. JPlayer was, I believe, an Italian company that is still around, and they're updating it. It's an open source player, and it's not like it's any less valid today. I just left it out because I thought that was going to become a more popular player than it did at the time. So the ones that I review in my update to the magazine, which should be out shortly in the next print issue, were these 6 here. I didn't have VoPlayer in my original assessment 4 years ago. I didn't have Bitmoveins as well in that. I always want to say Bitmoveins, like, you know, just because it sort of sounds a little jazzy that way. And just to go through each of these, I didn't really build out a slide deck around each one of these. I will show you sort of the code that goes into setting up a player quick and easy so that you can see how easy it is to test players as I get into that portion of my talk. But, you know, really what matters is knowing your requirements, right? I mean, today, you know, compared to 4 years ago, it's a different landscape, right? I mean, every platform now has their own player, right? So a lot of my clients are just doing, I shouldn't say just, but they're largely doing social media outreach with their videos. So going to Facebook, going to YouTube, using things like Vimeo Live or Vimeo's VOD solution. Those are all off-the-shelf video platforms that don't require you to bring your own player tech to the table, right? You just use their players because they have an all-in-one solution. In fact, most of those platforms don't let you just sort of use their other services and then, you know, plug and play your own kind of player. You have to go all in. And those requirements, again, these are the same requirements that I put in that 4-year-old article. My process for vetting any kind of tech stack, it doesn't matter whether it's player, encoder, or server side, you know, largely revolve around these 4 principles. What are you doing with your video? You know, when I say nature, it's not so much, you know, what is the subject matter? It's just more what what goes into the production of your video. Features, what does your player need to do? The pipeline, how do you get your video from to its final resting place? That doesn't sound very good. Resting place, that means it's dead. No, its final viewing place. And business, most importantly, like what's the time frame? How much money are you going to throw at this effort just for playback? It's a little small in the projection here in my notes afterwards. Again, if you don't know how stream media works, actually I always want to ask that. How many people are new to stream media in the crowd? Just see a show of hands. A lot of you are, okay. I'm always impressed at how many new people are coming to stream media and haven't been here before. A fair portion of people are always new, which is great. And it's we've been in this, I have the 20-year pin for the stream media company here. Not that I've been with stream media for 20 years, but I have been in the industry for 20 years. And it's amazing that there's still so many opportunities and problems to solve with video, right? Where I would still say it feels like the Wild West a bit. But as I was reviewing what I did 4 years ago, I basically, and if you compare my latest charts that I'm about to show you to what I showed 4 years ago, Flash was a big part of this, right? 4 years ago even though Adobe was already on its way out, the iPhone had been already introduced 4 years ago, Flash was still a very important stopgap for many of my clients. And I still have some lingering folks in that camp right now. They have very specialized solutions. They don't need the kind of target reach that other clients might have, and they have Flash still in that pipeline. And a lot of solutions are still RTMP based under the hood, right? Which doesn't require Flash, but RTMP was a transport that Macromedia started, and then Adobe took over once they took over that company. So RTMP workflows are still around. They're not going anywhere anytime soon, and I suspect even after Adobe sunsets Flash Player in 2020, there's still going to be some RTMP transport going on under the hood. But when it comes to our playback engines, most of these players have now, in their latest version, don't have any kind of mention of Flash in their documentation. Some never had Flash. VideoPlayer is a great example of that. That when they sort of hit the ground running with a non-plugin based architecture, so it didn't have any kind of Flash fallbacks. They had largely focused on HLS in the beginning, so they were already sort of in that camp from the very get-go, and that was. I don't want to say that's why they were excluded. VideoPlayer wasn't brand new in 2014, but it certainly didn't have the reach and appeal at the time with the type of clients that I was dealing with. And I would like to also just preface that for the most part, I've had some experience with all of these players one way or another, even if it was just for R&D for a client as they were vetting players. I would say by far, and I mentioned this in the 2014 article as well, that if I had to say hands down, JWPlayer is the most popular player, at least from my point of view of like clients coming to me with existing solutions. I generally don't have to recommend players to clients with many of their installations because they've already adopted something. I'll recommend a switch if they're having problems. I have a client right now that's using an older version of FlowPlayer, and that's likely their problem, and that's why I think this is a relevant conversation now, is because people are reevaluating their playback stacks, right? How many people here are at this session because they're sort of in a player transition right now? I would say a fair number of you. So it's a good time, just like a lot of folks are re-examining how they're encoding their assets, whether it's VOD or live. Like, can I use HEVC yet? What's all this AV1 nonsense being taught? I shouldn't call it nonsense. I'm just sort of emulating talk. But there's always something new on the plate. But I think we are, this year and next year and probably the year after that, especially as we get closer to this end of Flash official kind of thing. Not that Flash is premeditating this, but I think a lot of older clients are coming back to me, people I haven't heard from a while, because they still have an RTMP fallback layer. They're wondering how that's going to move forward. Like, what's our fallback? And you just sort of have to coach them into being not so scared that, well, most people aren't using Flash anymore. They don't have it installed on their browser. So this fallback that you were relying on, don't worry about it. The biggest problem with that, I would say, is larger organizations or organizations that don't have tremendous IT budgets. Like I do a lot of work in the government sector, and I have to make sure still that older versions of IE that may not have media source extensions, which is pretty old, right, is something that can be supported. So by and large, all of these browsers and all of these players work across the, I would say the browser is the limitation that these players have to work within now. Because we don't have a singular entity like Adobe managing a plugin stack that, made these a fallback or an alternative possible, now all these vendors are basically beholden to browser stacks to make their tech work. I'm not saying they can't do something that works on a unique value proposition within these browser stacks, but with iOS and MSE, there's certain limitations that when it comes to browser playback. And I should also state, if I haven't, I don't think I have already, that this is largely for browser-based playback or even progressive web app playback. Whenever you're dealing with a non-native application space and you need to address a player. Most of these companies, especially the bigger commercial ones, I would say only the you look at the Bitmoveins, the JWPlayers, the VoPlayers, and other players out there. A lot of their business value comes in their SDKs for mobile, so that if you want to, build your own native app on Android and iOS, that these companies will have done a lot of the hard work in terms of making a easier playback experience exist in your app. Now, of course, that's where they also charge a lot more. So you pay for those mobile SDKs likely more than you will for a browser-based subscription to their player, right? If you want to use JWPlayer on web player, you're going to probably be around, you're going to be starting at $500 a year and then going up based on the features that you use. And that's one of the, I have a couple more diagrams to show, but I'm going to hold on this slide to just largely talk about how to approach commercial vendors. Even here in the exhibit hall, you're in a unique position, of course, as Stream Media, to talk to all these vendors firsthand. There's, anyone that's a commercial product is on that floor, at least as far, I don't know if JWPlayer has a booth, but I know Bitmovein has a big booth, so you can talk to them. And I will mention, Bitmovein, I have a working relationship with most of these companies, but it's not like I play favorites, right? Again, I largely work on the demands that my clients bring to me and the types of consulting that I work for them. And as I've already stated, JWPlayer and FlowPlayer as a close second are the two players that most of my clients already have existing footprints with. But I'm seeing an uptick with Bitmovein. I've had at least 3 new clients this year that are using Bitmovein specifically for DRM delivery, so the way that Bitmovein ties into existing DRM layers, whether it's Easy DRM or By DRM or any of those other vendors in that space, more and more how those stacks all work together also will dictate your experience. But the number one thing I point out in my article that's about to come out in the next issue is really just approaching each of these companies about how they're going to license their player to you. Because I won't name names because I don't want to pick on people but in this list. But I have had, from those same companies that I just mentioned that have come to me with existing players, come back to me and say, we're having an issue. This company now wants to raise our annual subscription through the roof, like tenfold. Like a company may have been paying a $500 or $1,000 annual fee, and then a vendor will come back and say, you know what? We've been looking at your traffic and your patterns, and you're selling your video. We want like 10 grand or 20 grand or 30 grand. Like I've seen some exorbitant jumps in pricing. So I would say with any of the, and that is concerning to me on a number of levels when I see that kind of behavior within the industry. Mainly, I mean, we obviously have a choice, and you could just like you could change a phone carrier or maybe a cable provider or OTT provider for your content. When a company invests in a player stack, that's usually a longer term investment. You're not, once you get it integrated into your chain, it's not just a simple operation to swap it out. It's gonna, you're gonna have to do all sorts of testing over again. So going back to the what I would say the most important takeaway I would want you to have from you coming here and spending time with me today is to make sure you grill any vendor you're about to talk about long-term commitments and how you could potentially, like, hey, you know, we don't have a lot of traffic right now, and but how will my pricing change as I start to become more popular? And more importantly, what will happen if we have a disagreement? Like, can I just stick with a current, like if I don't, like let's say, you know, there's all these platforms have versioned players, right? Like with JWPlayer, they're on version 8, and they don't stop you from using 7 or 6 before it. You know, I have several clients that are still on a 6 or 7 implementation of JWPlayer, and JWPlayer doesn't force you to go to 8 or anything like that, but I find that their pricing isn't really tied to the version you're on, right? Like I could understand where it's just like, you know what, you can keep your, you know, current pricing with the current version that you're playing, but if you want to use JWPlayer 8, then we're going to re-examine. Like I wouldn't have as much an issue with that as I would with a client coming and telling me that they sort of feel that they're being held hostage. I find that more and more we are seeing transparency in this industry, more so than we've ever seen before. If you go to Bitmoveins' site, I will pick on Bitmoveins' site is very clear about player impressions and how your costs will change with their licensing. They're very, like, you don't even have to talk to sales. Their website's fairly apparent. I'm not even going to bring it up. But, you know, anytime you see, talk to one of our sales reps anytime you want to get into the enterprise category. I get a little worried about that because that means that they want to have a conversation with you that they don't exactly want to be advertising their rates on. And so, and I'll pick on VoPlayer a little bit there because last I checked when I was writing the article, they had that ask one of our consultants for pricing. And I just find like you should be able to have some idea, and I don't, and again, it should be, if you have to ask, then you're not the right customer. You know, like there should be, I'm hoping that that we'll see more transparency in this market, just like you do more so these days with cloud providers, right? It's easy to compare services between Google Cloud and AWS and Azure because their pricing is transparent. That's not to say you can't negotiate different deals with any of those vendors. If you're a big player and you want to negotiate better bandwidth, then, you know, if you've got a large ask, there's room for negotiation. And I think you can probably negotiate with any of the commercial vendors that I have listed in this space, but just, again, you know, I would even recommend you could say, hey, I just heard that there's some issues around pricing as with established clients as we move forward. Just you know, if that's my biggest concern when I see that kind of player lock-in, or as they say in government, a vendor lock-in. Like it's once you build a solution around something that you really have to just swallow whatever pill they want you to swallow when it comes to their player pricing. Okay, so let me go to my next slide. So the previous slide I was just showing how general HTTP delivery, and when I say general HTTP delivery, I mean range requests, kind of non-protected video where you might not even be doing adaptive ABR kind of delivery, right? Like a one site, like, you know, hey, I've encoded an MP4 file, I want to throw it up, it's a 30-second product video or whatever, do I need adaptive bitrate? Something that's like easy peasy to throw out. And this is more to just show you as well, not so much the player space, but that it's really the browsers, again, that dictate, well, you know, Bitmoveins can't advertise that they can play HEVC on an older browser. That's just not something they could do because they're not in control of that. But what does dictate how Playback works, again, it's the browser stack. So I sort of did the research on this to give you the, you know, version numbers of browsers that support these basic operations when it comes to Playback. And of course, and again, every vendor is able to take advantage of what the browser stacks allow them to do. And this is also a comparison to the article that was 4 years ago, 4 years old, in that you know, the vendors, again, generally all can do the same things when it comes to transport layers, again, because they're bound by the browser layer that's dictating that kind of playback stack. In the past, Flash was a differentiator, right? Like JWPlayer might have a Flash renderer, whereas another vendor did not have a Flash renderer. So I made care to sort of differentiate between those renderers that were available. These days, the rendering stack is as far as I'm discussing it here, is the browser browser stack. Native HLS, of course, is available now in browsers, not just Apple browsers, right? If you're using Edge 17 or higher, you can copy and paste HLS URLs right into the browser and they'll work. And the same thing with HEVC. The asterisk next to HEVC playback is there's caveats, and I don't have it didn't fit from my graphic onto the slide. Those footnotes, but it's basically where the hardware supports it. So or rather Edge 17 and higher will do HEVC playback, but there has to be a hardware layer that supports it. So not every Edge 17 implementation will necessarily support HEVC playback. There has to be a hardware layer there that's going to support it. And with Safari as well, you have to be using the later operating systems like High Sierra or greater in order to leverage HEVC on Safari desktop. So those are largely what those footnotes are about. And then this is sort of the trickier category. I say trickier because this is where I think you can start it's amazing to me that even some open source frameworks like ElementJS and VideoJS now have dash playback available, because that means they've invested into using libraries in their code, right? Everyone should understand that there's no native dash player in a browser, right? You have to have a JavaScript library that does the low-level work of parsing things out to the media source extensions and APIs that are available, or the encrypted media extensions as well if you're doing DRM. So again, this is largely determined by the browser stack, but again, it's interesting. It was a good exercise for me to go through this just to see how well the free VideoJS and ElementJS have kept up with this. I'll also sort of pick on VideoJS that I was somewhat concerned with VideoJS ever since Zencoder was bought by Brightcove, because you get, once a company owns an open source repository, how much love do they really give the now community edition versus what they're doing with it internally? Do they release those bits to the public? The more there's parity between that, and the better, of course, for the people that want to use that tech in a license-free kind of way. I have no problem with there being upsells on an open source stack, but generally the community edition starts to suffer, even whether it's respect to documentation on how that player works, or just on the addressing of any bugs or new features as browser stacks allow them. I don't know why my desktop seems to still be dinging, even though I thought I turned off all my volume. Maybe that's coming through something else. I'm going to just make sure I've quit any. Yeah, we don't need messages open. I thought I quit out of all my other messages. So, and emails closed. Maybe that's coming from something else that I'm not aware of. Anyway, apologize for that diversion there. And this is again. So we're only. The biggest limitation right now, I think, with media source extensions was its lack of availability in iOS, and how that moves, how that changes moving forward will be interesting. But and again, I think other transport layers that these players don't address. I mean, one thing that was interesting was that because JWPlayer and other players addressed the Flash layer with RTMP, and they had live in there. It's going to be interesting to see how these player stacks, where applicable. Like, I don't think VoPlayer is going to start addressing WebRTC anytime soon. But is it going to be in the purview of JWPlayer to become a WebRTC player? Like, if I want to start playing WebRTC streams, will one of these players sort of step up to the plate and become a WebRTC player? Not likely anytime soon. It'll be interesting to see again, like how the thinking of video and video transports of the days of yore, when there was Flash around, and as we see other tech stacks replacing the same things that Flash did, will these player stacks make it easier for us to do that as well, right? So, for the most part, I think these players are in a one-to-many environment, right? You're using a player when you're not using any kind of interactive real-time layer. And that sort of brings me to a point that I wanted to address. Again, I don't have it in a slide per se, but the low latency argument. If you need a player for low latency, even in one-to-many, right? You're running an auction house, or you're doing some kind of live trivia game, could you use any of these player stacks in a browser player player platforms in a browser stack where it works. Again, they all, the commercial guys have SDKs where you could start to integrate their players into your own native apps. But again, how much control do they give you to the buffering of that stream? If you really want to dial it down to, like, something that you got used to using in Flash, like a 1/10 of a second buffer. Can you do that with any of those lower latency transports? So as we move forward, I'm going to start getting into just common features. I mean, again, this is sort of, there's nothing, no big revelations here. As we start, as time marches on, and these all these player vendors have time to integrate new features, these are becoming pretty standard, especially the casting part, right? I mean, it's becoming more and more common now, just as a default player implementation, that as I'm watching video in a web browser, that I can actually access a casting capability. These are all, again, pretty common controls that you would see. And it's funny, I threw closed captions and subtitles into the extra feature stack just because it's more how well do they deal with closed captions and subtitles. One of the annoying things I have with JWPlayer, and I'm sure there's a fix out there that I just haven't bothered to find yet, is that I always, like if I'm doing live streaming from Wowza, for example, I always get a closed caption button. And I've had clients, and only on certain browsers, and it's just like there's no captions there to be displayed, so it's sort of misleading, and turning it off can be as simple as just removing it from the skin you're using on that player. But again, it's just like, why am I seeing captions when, or captions control when there should not be captions? I think it remains to be seen whether the other one, everything's somewhat self-explanatory on this list, but the VR360 playback is an interesting space. I mean, I know I have friends here at this conference that they almost get irate when they don't see an uptick in VR and 360 video, and it's I just don't see that as an immediate growth market. I think VR has always had this appeal that isn't a mass appeal. Again, I would say it's the same market. It's like a market like low latency video. If you don't really need this immersive experience, and the VR people will be like, everything should be immersive. Well, yeah, but I'm not going to be carrying that gear around all the time or whatever. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves. Again, I'm not saying that 360 playback isn't going to have its heyday, but I've yet to see it sort of explode where to date I've had one client in over a decade come to me with a VR 360 problem, and it was for a insect repellent campaign where they were literally showing a mountaintop in 360 live, and it was sort of, again, it was pretty gimmicky, and like I don't know if it led to any uptick in sales of this bug repellent, but that's about the only campaign I've seen come across my way. Again, I'm not trying to say, well, I don't want to sound like some flat earther. Oh no, I'm not a flat earther, by the way. But where it's just like, well, my experience is that the Earth is flat. It's just like, well, just because I don't do VR 360 work doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So just because I can't see that the Earth is round, that it isn't round. But that's sort of anyway, maybe I shouldn't have gone there. It's too quiet in the crowd. Maybe I'm surrounded by some flat earthers. Anyway, so what I'm going to do now is aggrandize myself by showing older pictures of me when I'm a little bit younger. Actually, that was just, I think, from the last one. But I wanted to just sort of demo each of these players to show you just how common, they're starting to look and feel all the same, right? And so these are just still grabs, but just on a skinning level, that's MediaElementJS. And just so you know, if you've never heard of MediaElementJS, it is, I think it still is part of the core WordPress foundation too for some of their video playback engine tinkering that's going on there. So MediaElement has been around for a while, and it's integrated in some fairly common CMSs like WordPress. VideoJS, I can sort of animate myself. But the VideoJS, of course, you've heard of. It's been around since Steve Heffern from ZenCoder built it. And again, sort of it almost looks identical to the last skin I just showed you. Bitmovein, you can see their logo in it. That's their default skin. All of these skins, of course, can be changed. I'm going to demo just the playback and their code shortly. FlowPlayer as well has their differentiator. You can see right away this default skin has the casting icon. It's got full screen. All those kind of bells and whistles that you would expect. There's JWPlayer's default skin and VoPlayer's. So what I'm going to do next is go into my localized version. Oh, I'm not getting power. Look at that. I'm at 20%. That's because I'm not plugged in. That's here. Let's get that in. I was in a haste to make sure the HDMI worked. There we go. Now we're charging. So the good news is that most of these players are freely available, easily accessible online to get their libraries to test. You may not even have to talk to sales staff. In fact, FlowPlayer didn't respond to any of my requests, so I just grabbed the FlowPlayer library from their sample player and started playing with it. Most of them will let you test over local host, so you can see I'm just running MAMP on this machine. MAMP is a Mac-specific version of the Apache MySQL PHP stack, and I'm not using anything other than the Apache web server to run these demos. So there's nothing fancy going on. It's just that local host is usually whitelisted as a playback domain. A lot of the commercial players will use the domain name of the player to determine whether or not your player will work. So VoPlayer was really great. I approached them, and their sales guy gave me sort of a default package to work with, which it wasn't like it was interesting. It was an interesting experience to approach each of these vendors after 4 years to sort of see how easy it was, just even for a reviewer like me for a magazine, to get access to the bits. Bitmoveins set me up with an account right away, and I could clearly go in and sort of see my dashboard, my setup. VoPlayer sent me a zip file with the build files that were specific to the deployment they gave me. VideoJS and Media Element, of course, are open source, so I didn't have to really talk to anyone for those. I already mentioned FlowPlayer. I didn't establish any kind of contact with. I just worked with what was freely available. And I've had a pretty good relationship with JWPlayer over the years. I have a dev account on their platform specifically for the players, so that if I ever want to test things. And again, that's largely because if there was one player that most of my clients use, it would be JWPlayer. But again, that's largely for legacy reasons, not necessarily, because they just started using it when they first started. I'm just going to go alphabetically here, so I'm going to go into Bitmoveins player. So you can see it loading here. It's all loading those files locally, so the JavaScript library is pretty quick to load up. I'm just going to quickly play. I'm going to mute this. I don't think I'm broadcasting over HDMI. I turned all the volumes down, but I can scrub through. This is just a progressive. Actually, I switched it so that this is using both an HLS transport as well as a fallback progressive MP4 file. And I'll quickly, again, it's like when it comes into what you see here, there's a video quality that I can sort of choose. So I can tell right away that it picked the HLS manifest, and because I'm in Chrome, it's letting me select, if I want to choose one of the bit rates that's in the HLS stream that I'm sending it. It's just a Wowza stream that I have set up on one of my Wowza boxes, and I can change between those bit rates. Just like again, usually when you're running HLS through a iOS or Safari stack, you may not have abilities to access the qualities because they're offloading that to the native HLS renderers by those browser stacks. And when so that's another tip I would just say, make sure it goes without saying, I should say, but I would remind you to test across different browsers. It's one of the reasons I like using Mac, because on Windows, I can't just test Safari on Mac, obviously, because I'm on Windows. So Windows, obviously, if you have to be compliant with older browser stacks, and Windows would fit into that, make sure you're testing against those stacks and those player version or those browser versions. But by and large, I'm going to now just hop into each of the code for these, just so you can see. Let me make sure I've got the right one open. This is indeed. Don't laugh at me for using Dreamweaver. It's just part of the Creative Cloud suite. It's funny because I was just talking to a friend like, do they even talk about Dreamweaver at Adobe Max? Like, I have no idea. I haven't gone to an Adobe Max in years. But you can see that there's, most of these players work the same. I'll sort of just show, there's a Bitmovein library that I just address in the head, and then I have a placeholder for the video. That's typically what I like to do. It doesn't matter whether it's JWPlayer. You create a div, you do whatever you want to that div, and the video is going to fill in that space. So there's a player div, and then we're going to populate it with JavaScript using this player payload. And you can see I've commented some things out from this particular Bitmovein setup. You can see that I have a player key in there as well. And so that key works against the domains. Obviously, my key is freely available in the view source if anyone saw it. So it's not necessarily like that key needs to be protected. It's just identifying this content as well. Anyway, so I've got sources I can set up. That's pretty common across JWPlayer and other players that support multiple playback renditions. I've commented out the dash. That was some Bitmovein demo that they had in there. So I replaced it with my own HLS, put my own progressive local. You can see it's a relative link to just a sample file locally. And then you initialize the player with that config stack. That's fairly common as you look at these stacks. So there's nothing really. Again, what was great for me to see in just testing very basic setups like this is that it was very quick and dirty for me to just see, like, well, if they're and I like to use Chrome just because Chrome is going to be using for sure the MSE extensions under the hood. So I would make sure you pick if you're compromised for time when you're playing testing players. Chrome's not a bad starting place to use for your player because you know that they're going to be using a MSE and EME approach to the breakdown of that. So you might see differences in HLS playback, for example, from a Bitmovein to a Theo player. So and taking the same source and seeing, well, does it take longer to buffer on this one? Used to I'm co-chair with Jan of the Video Engineering Summit, and David from Realize just gave a session at the Video Engineering Summit on video diagnostic tools. And the only reason I mentioned that is that when you're coming into test players like this, I would try to break them, right? And see what happens with, if you know you have a known good source, an HLS stream that you feel has been properly encoded and it should play back well. And that's another reason I like Mac. David in his last session was talking about Charles Proxy, which is a tool you can install, but I often will use the network link conditioner. So if you're on Mac, if you're I think it used to be part of the Xcode install, extended tools, the network link conditioner. You should be able to find it on the developer portal, which requires you to be a member of the Apple developer portal, pay the $100 a year or whatever fee to it. But this is really nice because it doesn't, it works at a network level. I can turn on this, I can start ratcheting down my profile. How quickly does the player switch over to a lower bitrate stream? Does it sit there? Does it rebuffer? Make sure you use tools that can help you test a player if you're considering a player switch. So especially with adaptive, have something that allows you to test playback. Also, or rather network conditions, also just yanking out your Ethernet if you're testing over or disabling wireless. What happens when you do that? Just know how your player is going to behave in certain situations. Easy enough to test on your own. So that's Bitmovein. Let me go ahead and go back to my directory listing there. And I'm just going to jump to FlowPlayer next. So again, you sort of saw it had its own little loading screen. There were some dots. It loaded fairly quickly. Again, this is all over a local web server. And I can, again, sort of see how its default look and feel for FlowPlayer. Because I'm using it in a local host environment, I may see the I have the FlowPlayer overlay here as I start to go around. And what's interesting, again, this as soon as I see these colors and this layout from a UX perspective, I can tell this is FlowPlayer because they've largely, as a default skin, this sort of sticks with their brand and what they've done over there. It's funny how that's like the video blue, right? Bitmoveins has blue, FlowPlayer has blue. I think even JWPlayer at one point had blue in their branding, but it's a cool video color, I guess. But anyway, so again, FlowPlayer. I'm just going to FlowPlayer. Just in general, I've felt that some of their documentation isn't as straightforward as it should be. They try and dumb down a lot of their documentation so that it's easy for beginners to read it. But I find when it comes to sort of I also tend to scrutinize their advanced documentation. Like what can I do? What's the extent of control that I have on your player? Should I need to take control of it? But you can see here, it's this is a most players have a non-JavaScript way to do it. Like you can see, I'm importing those libraries, still calling out these sources to FlowPlayer. FlowPlayer has a dependency on jQuery as well, if you want to do video tags as simple as I've done here. So notice that even though I have a div for FlowPlayer, I'm just using the basic video tag to tell the DOM where I want this video to be, and FlowPlayer is just saying, hey, anytime you see a video tag, go ahead and override it with our code, right, and do what you need to do. So in this example, I'm just calling a straightforward range request MP4 file, but just as a differentiator. And again, it's sort of what they position in their demo code when they show it to you. This is how they'd prefer you to use it, but you can use it in different ways. However, is the documentation there to help you do it in more complicated or more scripted ways. I would leave you to scrutinize that as well. So again, we're going to sort of see the same pattern here. Library listed in the head, video tags and or div tags to differentiate to dictate where that player goes. Let me go ahead. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm just going to make sure I do my due diligence here. JWPlayer, that's interesting there too. You'll notice that with JWPlayer, didn't necessarily preload the first frame here. I may have specified a bad poster frame, so it could have been my fault too. But when I hit play here, again, this is now the newer skin that JWPlayer has with JWPlayer 8. And again, they've got pretty well-documented skinning controls on their player. And if you're my preference is to use a JavaScript payload. That's just my personal preference when I'm building out proof of concept players, rather than trying to figure out how they use the video tag. Because if you look at VideoJS, they do a lot of video tag enhancements, right? They'll put a lot of class architecture into the video tag in order to control how VideoJS works. We'll likely see that, but this is a very simple implementation of JWPlayer. Again, just link out to the library, and it's that easy to, I could get more complicated with my sources, but very easy to just throw it into that player div, control that div with CSS, and then that's how my player is going to respond. Let's go ahead and also jump into the last two are actually we have 3 more to go. Media element has largely looked the same over the years. I find it's interesting, their default skin is fairly the same as it was 4 years ago. Again, I'm just going to seek through this to show you how sort of their skin updates as I go through it. And the media element code, just to show that one. Oh. Where is am I overlooking it? Oh, right there. Sorry, I should be wearing my glasses. Nope, not the source. Let's open up index. Again, really simple implementation. You just, they have a minified JavaScript library. This too is using jQuery as a dependency because I chose to just go with a quick and dirty video tag implementation. Notice that they use this class differentiator to let the initialization code know that this is a video tag it should affect. So because I've set it up that way, it's pretty easy. Not a lot of code to just get a simple player up and working. And again, you could set these sources to whatever source type you need. HLS should be universally supported across all of these players. And let me go to the last two, media element, and I'm going to go into VideoPlayer. And again, you can see this is how VideoPlayer delivered it to me. They gave me a build as a zip file. I uncompressed that zip file and started updating parameters. So that's again, all of these are skinnable. They don't have to be branded by a VideoPlayer play icon, but that's their play icon, of course. And I can go in here and start, playing it. So VideoPlayer, again, is quite different than the other players in that they started out, they were one of the first HLS only kind of players. I shouldn't say HLS only, but they definitely specialized in HLS and being able to do things with HLS first in JavaScript that no one else was doing at the time. And you can see it's a little more complex here. Not terribly complex, but just in the sense that, again, we see a div with VideoPlayer classes assigned to it. And then we have the VideoPlayer API being called. You can see I've commented out some dash sources. I threw in my own HLS source just because, again, I wanted to use my own sources against the player. So this is really the bulk of the setting up the source right there. Again, a little more complicated and just sort of the access to the, they have a class with a sub method in it called player that then instantiates all of the UI and library locations. So I don't want to say it had a steep learning curve. I just, because it was the first time I ever had used VideoPlayer, and that's something I want to point out that to date I've had one client consider VideoPlayer. It wasn't because they didn't like VideoPlayer that they didn't go with it. They just had a pivot with what they needed to do. So, but I probably have the least amount of experience with VideoPlayer out of all the players that I've said, just because, again, it's just with the clients that I've addressed with the kind of consulting I do, it's not something I've had to deal with yet. But I was glad to understand how their process works. And they are now, if you go to their site, CMAF, Dash, they're doing all sorts of things to enhance that part of the delivery. Again, I do think, I'll pick on them for a little bit just in, yes, they're in the back. Oh, I saw that in the class there. That might just have been an oversight on my part. It should, as far as I know, there was no, let's take that out of there. I don't know if they, you know what, that's.
I think we thought it was, we were going to ask them because we did some evaluation.
Yeah.
And they built it on thought.
I don't know, you want to see if we break it? Should we break it? I'll just throw out the bone that VideoJS doesn't necessarily mean they're using VideoJS, just because it could just be the name they called that class. Like, here's the JavaScript file for video, right? So, but it would be a little weird if they left it in there, like as. But let's go ahead and save it. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I'm gonna go ahead and reload it. Let's see what. Oh, I broke it. So. And let's go ahead and undo that. And well, it's easy enough. We should, I don't know, let's just tinker real quick. It's a good question. So they don't have a video.js file in the build, so you can see these are the different classes that they've given me. And I'm not gonna, I don't know, like the chromeless, these are all gonna be minified. Oh, this isn't minified, that's good. Oh, that's pretty minified. So I'm not going to attempt to, start to diagnose the JavaScript based on that. But that's a good. You should be able to ask them definitively. Are they based on VideoJS? You think it is? Okay, there you go. So I don't know if that's necessarily bad or good. It'd be curious to know how lockstep they keep their development. Like, does that mean if VideoJS has a new release, if they stay lockstep with it or not. And that is an interesting thing that I will, now that I'll just transition to VideoJS next. I've worked with VideoJS. It's been a while since I've had a VideoJS implementation, but I was a fan of the architecture that they promoted. I mean, if you go look on on the GitHub repository. There's a lot of contributors who have built plugins. They call them plugins. I sort of gave Steve a little bit of grief when he called them plugins. I'm like, really? We're trying to get away from this whole notion of Flash as a plugin. You're going to call these JavaScript little widgets plugins? I just thought that was weird. And he was just like, what else? I was like, anyway. I sort of said, well, I don't know, Wowza calls stuff modules, like think of another word. Anyway, and that's I'll say my biggest pet peeve with VideoJS is that they can't control the contributors who contribute to those things. So I've definitely tried widgets, I'll call them widgets for lack of a better word. I've tried their widgets that break with the current version, right? They're only tested up to a certain release of VideoJS, and then they break or fall apart or don't work as expected because VideoJS changed an API that they were using, or the legacy API wasn't maintained, and so it breaks. I think it's funny, one of the differentiators that VideoJS had with their default skin is the play button in the top left corner. I remember Steve talking about that. It's like everyone puts it in the center. We're going to put ours in the top left corner. And you might not necessarily go, I mean, again, you can control that with the skinning layer. And if I play this, I'll start to see the skin and everything that I can do across this. And the code for VideoJS, let me just bring that up real quick. Again, since it's open source, you can see I don't have any localized files. I'm just using the 7.1 release here as a style sheet and as the VideoJS library down below. And you can see, again, because they don't have interestingly, there is no dependency on jQuery for VideoJS. They're able to, whatever bits they need to use for just controlling this video tag is pretty easy to do without a jQuery dependency. I don't worry so much about dependencies. Back in the day, like jQuery has a lot of overhead, right? I mean, like when you load jQuery, it uses up memory, and if you're being really picky about dependencies in a web app like this, you might be like, well, if I only need why do I need jQuery just to use a video player? Like I don't think it's going to make or break your evaluation of a player like this. But VideoJS, really straightforward. Again, this is a pretty simple implementation. So without further ado, and again, I want to see if I'm trying to think if I have an example. What's interesting about the players, and this is again where I will sort of use JWPlayer as a benchmark because I've gotten so used to JWPlayer. And I'll tell you the kind of things that I like to see in players that I've actually built encoding workflows around. And again, if you've been to other sessions, you'll know that I do a lot of work with the BC government. So I'm just going to pull up, let me see if I can find it real quick. It's going to be on my own server because he doesn't always migrate changes that I've done. So I just want to show you the kind of, and I've highlighted this before. Let me go to, did I put it in sits? Let me actually look at it locally here. Bear with me for just a quick sec while I find this in my local folder first. So I know I gotta just change sites here real quick so I know where I put it. I had this preloaded, there it is. That sits live. That's the live player. Let me see if I can, I just built this, there it is. So I did throw it into the MCS folder, okay. Security day, that's the one I want. So one of the things I've gotten used to with, and again, I'm not trying to highlight JWPlayer as the one to go to. It's more just, again, from a player perspective, what I expect in a web player, right? So this is just to give you the context, one of the things I do with BC government is produce their webcasts. I come in with my gear. I did a workshop yesterday highlighting a large part of that workflow. But this is an example of a full conference day, if you will, within a specific ministry at the government where the citizen services has security experts come in both from government and outside of government to present. So they get external vendors like IBM, Deloitte, they come in and sort of talk about whatever the security theme is. And they've been, I actually learned a lot of these, but one of the neat things, this is playlists in JWPlayer, so I can quickly, in JavaScript, and I'll show you I'll just view source on this. So, really easy to set up in JWPlayer a playlist with multiple videos. These are all HLS with ABR, each with their own dedicated poster frame. But more importantly, I'll just pick on Peter here from F5 Networks. When I've built my encoding API to basically do the thumbnail VTT file and thumbnail PNG that JWPlayer will bring in. So I really like that ability to add these kind of like thumbnails that I can scrub through, right? So that doesn't just come out of the box with JWPlayer. Again, I have to make sure my encoding workflow, and again, I'm using this more as a template for your own guide when you're evaluating a player. But like, if that's the kind of stuff you want to do, make sure your player stack is going to support it. More importantly, your encoding workflow is going to support it. So I've built my own REST API around FFmpeg, and so when I put a video through my API, it automatically generates assets as JWPlayer is expecting them. So a thumbnail VTT file that basically has, it's pretty cool. I mean, you can use, if you're not familiar with thumbnail sprite sheets, I'm just gonna see if I can find it real quick. If I load this same, I'm losing time here, but actually I won't bother, but you can use FFmpeg to generate a single JPEG or PNG or whatever image format that has all your thumbnails in a big PNG file that then this player will load and segment as all those thumbnails. So it's literally, when you're doing these thumbnails, it's just calling quadrants within that JPEG or PNG to show as I'm rolling my cursors. And you can see it's amazing how fast JavaScript and browsers are these days. That's not really specific to JWPlayer. So again, I just wanted to point out that and for me, again, it's really important to, if the government has a JWPlayer license, if they came to me and said, you know what, we need to change players because we need to use something open source or we can't continue to pay licensing fees, they've gotten used to this, right? So I need to make sure that whatever is going to come into play either has to be built on top of that or not. Did you have a question? Were you raising your hand, sir? Okay. Checking on my buddy Jerry there. Anyway, I'm already coming now to the end of my session, so I just wanted to end on that note of just sort of making sure that you thoroughly vet that, because you need me to tell you that. No. So anyway, thank you for your time. I'm happy to hang out here and address questions. We'll eat into our lunchtime a little bit, but and I'll also be down that way too. So thank you for your time. You had a question in the back?
Yeah, can you speak to security and analytics and how some of the players may treat those functions differently?
I guess the short answer to that is that I can't. JWPlayer is a good example of a platform where you can buy into more layers of their services, right? And analytics is one of those things that JWPlayer gave you more access to in their earlier licensing than they do now. You have to pay extra for some of the same analytics. When you say security, do you mean like DRM type of security, or just sort of them making sure that your data isn't used for, that your player metrics aren't being used for some other means? Is that both? It's I couldn't say definitively what's happening under the hood with player metrics with those companies. I mean, again, that would be a perfect question to ask to any of those vendors, hey, I'm doing work in this sector, and it's super important that you're not logging IPs of views of my that's actually an important point with government that I do, even on the WowZa level, they don't want me to log IPs of anyone watching the video. They just don't, as government, they don't want people to think that they're collecting any data on them. So that I would say just raise that point with a vendor that you're looking at to see where they're going to fit within that. Obviously, an open source solution, you would be in control of that because you're not necessarily using a hosted library. Like that's a good point to bring up too that I did earlier. It's like if it's important for you to maintain a localized version of the player that doesn't call home except for maybe a license key transfer, and again to ask them what are they doing with that, any requests that are going to them for a player to instantiate. Very good. Thank you for bringing that up. Any other questions, Casey?
VideoPlayer support WebRTC that you saw?
Not yet. Not one of those players I'm aware of has any WebRTC support. I used to be on some JWPlayer betas, and I brought it up 2 years ago, and they're just like, it's on our list, but I don't see them doing anything with it. Another question in the back.
How about metadata support outside of subtitle?
So, give me
Such as, say, embedded JSON-based metadata within BTP.
Oh, interesting. Well, I don't know anything again, that would be something where I'd want to make sure the API, their player API gave me a hook to look in. If I needed to introspect a layer deeper, do they have a way to do that with their API? And again, you would probably have more success with a VideoJ S type of player to get to those low-level bits if you have to. But that's about all I could say on that topic. Any other questions? Not that I'm trying to shoot everyone down very quickly with short answers, but I am sort of hungry. Are you hungry? Let's go eat. Thanks.